Hello, everyone. My name is Paloma Diaz, an Associate Director of Programs of Latin American, LLILAS Benson Latin American Studies and Collections. I would like to welcome everyone. Before introducing today's speakers, I would like to remind you that early voting starts here in Texas this Monday, October 13. For information about voting in your state, visit vote.org. Do not miss this opportunity to use your voice. As you will see in today's discussions, U.S. government's actions and policies not in this country, but they may have a global impact. Today, we have the privilege of presenting the book of one of our distinguished alumni, Steven Dudley's MS-13, The Making of America's Most Notorious Gang. This event is co-sponsored by HarperCollins Publishers and the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law of UT Austin. Steven Dudley is the co-founder and co-director of Inside Crime, a think tank focused on crime in the Americas. He's also senior fellow at the American University's Centers for Latin American and Latino Studies. Dudley has a BA in Latin American history from Cornell University, and more importantly for us, he has a master in Latin American studies from our university. As a journalist in Latin America, he spent the last 20 years writing for the Washington Post, NPR, BBC, and the Miami Herald. His book, The MS-13, is the winner of the 2019 Anthony Lucas Prize. Today, we're also honored to have with us our affiliated professor, Donna deCesare, an award-winning freelance visual journalist and professor in the UT School of Journalism. She is the recipient of the 2013 Maria Morska-Wood Award for Journalism. She's also the recipient of a number of distinguished awards. Her bilingual documentary book, Untitled Chapter, is a visual journey into the lives of children deeply affected by civil war and gang violence in Central America. Steve, now you have the spotlight.
Thank you, Paloma. It is an absolute honor to be here. I'm so excited to be able to talk to my alma mater like this, and all those who support it. I also support it, and it was hugely influential in my formation. So this is a fantastic honor. So thank you for organizing this, and thank you for the Robert Strauss Center as well for co-sponsoring this. This is really great. We'll obviously be talking with Donna later, and she knows this topic very well, but I just wanted to start with a short presentation to give people a sense of the book and what I was trying to achieve with this particular book. I guess if I had to describe the essence of the book, it is trying to understand or contextualize who this gang is. Like I came in thinking about what is this thing? What is the MS-13? It's a very common question, and I think the fundamental question here, because I don't think we really know. We certainly hear a lot about it, but the gang embodies a lot of it embodies a paradox of sorts. It is kind of nurturing, almost protective community or cocoon for some people. But it is also a vicious street gang that commits horrific crimes on the other side. And that's just the surface level paradox that this gang represents. So I tackled it from different vantage points. And at the very surface level, I wanted to chronicle the gang through the eyes of the gang members themselves. And that's the essence of the book. That's the core of the book. The thread of the book are these characters. And the main character among them is a person who I call Norman. And I don't identify him for security reasons, nor any of the features of his story all the names are changed so you can't sort of track him down that easily. But the essence of his story for me embodies the larger story. And I just wanted to start by reading a very short section, which is literally a snapshot of who he is, just to give you a sense of Norman. And I'm certain that Donna and I can talk more about him and other characters. So it reads like this, and this is from the introductory section. Norman was both victim and victimizer, a product of a family that embodied all the complexity and contradictions that make up the story of the MS-13. He grew up in El Salvador, the youngest of 7. When he was a boy, the army came to his house, took 2 of his brothers to their barracks, and forced his mother to choose which one to leave in the army and which one to take home. Norman and his family had lived through gun battles, death squads interrupted dinner. People in his neighborhood disappeared, and rebels executed a soldier on leave right in front of him. His home life was equally turbulent. His father left his mother for one of Norman's maternal cousins when Norman was just a toddler, creating a parallel family that competed with his. Norman's mother plunged into depression, attempting suicide on at least one occasion. The tumult led to a family exodus. By the time Norman was 16, the civil war in El Salvador was over, but all of his brothers and sisters had fled to the United States. Norman and his family sought stability within the gang, the MS-13, of course. Its brash leaders, most of whom had been deported from the US, became his stand-in guardians. 2 of his brothers joined the MS-13 in Los Angeles. 2 of his half-brothers would later become members in El Salvador. Norman joined in El Salvador after his most beloved brother, who'd long acted as a surrogate father, had been murdered in the US. The MS-13, he decided, would be his family, his community. And therein lies the first paradox of this organization. It provides this kind of protective cover for a lot of these guys, at least in their eyes, and especially at the onset of their intersection with this street gang. So we think of it as a street gang. We come into the story more often than not when these guys already have orange jumpsuits on, handcuffs behind their back. We don't know anything about them. This is an attempt to tell the story leading up to those moments in many cases. The second level of this book is an attempt to describe the evolution of the street gang as a street gang, covering literally the 40-year history of the street gang, and the way in which the evolution interacts with the law enforcement response. So there's a kind of push and pull, a constant push and pull between these street gangs and how they're evolving, and then the response to the street gangs and how that evolves, and then how the street gangs have another further evolution, etc. And that plays out throughout the entire book and is a key component of understanding this gang, because we need to understand it in this larger context. So it's not just about why these individual members are getting involved and contextualizing that aspect of it, but it's also about the way public policy and the gang's reactions to those public policies are also, sort of feeding this evolution of this gang, which again has been around for 40 years and now has, thousands of members across half a dozen countries in this region alone. So, want to try and sort of decipher how this whole thing happened, and that push and pull between these two forces is part of that. And in order to kind of, illustrate that a little bit, I have plucked out a section that's more towards the, a little bit into the book, and it concerns one of the characters called Alex Sanchez. Alex Sanchez, very famous ex-gang member who now heads up something called Homies Unidos in Los Angeles. So at this point in the book, Alex Sanchez is he is into the gang. He eventually gets out of the gang, and then he gets into the Homies Unidos, which is this anti-gang organization based in Los Angeles. But at this point in the story, he's into the gang, and he's very into the gang. And we can see kind of how his own actions and the actions of the gang begin to interact in this way with the actions of the security forces in Los Angeles, specifically the police. This is from chapter 3. One day, just after Alex turned 15, his mom got a phone call from his school. Alex had missed class. Again, furious, she stormed into his room. "I'm going to send you home," she screamed, referring to El Salvador. By then, Alex didn't want to go back to El Salvador. He had friends, access to drugs and alcohol, and was enjoying himself in Los Angeles. He was fed up with his mom's rants, her beatings, and the Jehovah's Witnesses that hovered around their house. Although he had a broken arm at the time, he grabbed her car keys, tumbled from the second floor window into the urine-stained driveway, and drove away. Alex spent most of the next few years on the streets, only returning to his mother's apartment for short stints when he was released from juvenile hall or later from prison. Alex was not alone. He said there were a steady group of about a dozen Mara bouncing from place to place. Homelessness was common in gangs, a natural byproduct of broken homes, abusive guardians, and traumatic childhoods. The abuse often intensified in the streets. For a while, Alex said he lived with other Mara Salvatrucha in the basement of a man's home. In lieu of rent, the gang members offered the owner stolen items, which he could resell. The Mara attracted girls, many of whom were also runaways, and the group in turn attracted older men who solicited sex from the girls and the boys. A mini criminal economy formed. It did not last. A gang member would see a man trying to pick up his girlfriend, and the Mara would jump him. The owner also grew tired of the Mara Salvatrucha because they destroyed his basement. As the gang decamped to abandoned homes and empty apartment buildings, a pattern emerged. The Mara would create a mini criminal economy, make a little money, party, and eventually destroy the property. Toilets overflowed. Empty milk cartons and hot dog packages piled up in the corners. Crack pipes and liquor bottles were strewn across the hallways. It was time to move on to the next destroyer. The name caught on, eventually becoming a catch-all. A destroyer is still a crash pad, a party place, a meeting spot, a stash house, a torture chamber, a brothel, or all of the above. On the streets, Alex's run-ins with the police multiplied. He and a fellow gang member began robbing people who had jewelry or looked like they might have money. When that didn't work, they went into a local grocery store and shoplifted ham, cheese, and bread. When they got caught, the security guards would sometimes call their parents, other times call the police. Some police officers were worse than others. The Rampart division in central Los Angeles had a particularly violent reputation. Alex said he and other Mara would commit crimes in Rampart, then run to another territory because they didn't want to be captured by that division. They would beat the shit out of us, Alex said, and they would take us to rival neighborhoods and just drop us off and on the loudspeakers say who it was. "Hey, you're so-and-so from the MS." And then they would just take off, and all of a sudden you would have people coming out. You'd have no choice but to run after the cop car. The division was attempting to wrest control of an area spinning out of its grasp, but its violent tactics were a problem. In one case chronicled by a federal commission, police chased down a 24-year-old Latino suspect who'd hidden under a stairwell after crashing his car. Incensed, the police pounded the suspect into submission, and he lost an eye because of the excessive force. The victim sued the LAPD for $177,000. A report about the division said the LAPD described what it called Rampart culture. This included hazing new arrivals, getting them to wash the squad cars, load shotguns, and make sure other equipment was ready, as well as a slow indoctrination in the harsh ways of dealing with suspects. Between 1994 and 1998, the period the LAPD studied, Rampart police pursued suspects at double the rate of other divisions and injured them at 3 times the rate. Their use of force was higher, and their suspects were injured in these cases 59% of the time, the highest percentage in the city. Questions about their tactics were often dismissed with the mantra, "It's the Rampart Way." Rampart officers collected mementos from their forays into gang territory, hats, t-shirts, and other paraphernalia, a kind of wartime booty. Some division of officers even designed their own logo, a skull and a spread of cards they called the dead man's hand. What separated the Rampart culture from the rest of the department was the frequently heard chorus, "We do things differently here," the LAPD report read. Though not unique, this type of mentality was significantly more pronounced and pervasive at Rampart than in other divisions. The rough tactics didn't affect Alex or his Mata friends. In some ways, it made them more brazen. On the street, getting arrested and beaten by police was a badge of honor and a rite of passage. Alex was in and out of juvenile hall throughout the 1980s. Assault, robbery, breaking and entering, defacing property. One time he got out in the morning after a 14-month stint in prison and was in jail again by that evening, captured in the act of spray painting a wall with the words, "I'm back." The last sort of meta level, I would say, where this book lies and tries to tackle is this very complex relationship that exists between the United States and El Salvador. This is a topic that is not very discussed as it relates to the gang, but I think is central for a lot of reasons, most of which have to do with the fact that this relationship is so uneven. And it engenders this really perverse dependency on the part of El Salvador to the United States. And that is a very dangerous long-term position to be in. And El Salvador is just an example of many countries that have this relationship, but it's certainly an extreme one. So I just want to read with you, before opening this up, a section that sort of embodies or summarizes this very complex relationship between these two countries and why it's important to this story. People enter the U.S. without authorization to escape violence, threats, civil war, natural catastrophes, and economic peril, as well as to reunite with family. But these migration patterns are also the result of a long-established colonial relationship between the United States and Latin America. Few countries exemplify this history better than El Salvador. From cacao to coffee to cotton to textiles, the Salvadoran economy has long served foreign interests, first Spain and later the US, with devastating domestic consequences, near constant economic turmoil matched with massacres, war, and gang violence. The US has had a strong hand in these events, supporting military dictatorships and unscrupulous politicians, training repressive army battalions and covering up for their atrocities, deporting gang members en masse to El Salvador, and then washing its hands of the problems this creates. Despite, or perhaps because of this dynamic, many Salvadorans revere the United States. They adorn themselves with US status symbols, tennis shoes, name brand clothes, baseball hats. They adopt US sports. They integrate English into their everyday vernacular. They eat American food and purchase large US-made vehicles. In 2001, the country even adopted the US dollar as its national currency. As the Salvadoran poet Rocky Dalton once wrote, "The President of the United States is more president of my country than the president of my country." Life as a neo-colony means watching US sitcoms because they are the only ones on TV, driving US cars because they are the only ones on the lot, and wearing US clothes because they are the only ones on the racks. Salvadorans pay for it on both ends, accepting cheap wages to make US clothes, harvest US crops, and fight US wars. El Salvador did not so much adopt the US dollar as accept it as the best way to attract from the same country that walks all over them. Still, at this point, the bond is unbreakable. No other country has resettled in the US at the same rate relative to its population than El Salvador. In the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, during the country's civil war, around a quarter of El Salvador's population moved to the United States. Over 1.4 million first-generation Salvadorans still live in the US, or about 1 in every 5 Salvadoran people, a population nearly as large as the Chinese immigrant community in the US. Salvadorans have settled in Los Angeles, Houston, Washington, D.C., and other major Latino urban hubs. Half of all Salvadorans in the US live in California or Texas, and Los Angeles is the second largest Salvadoran city in the world, behind the country's capital, San Salvador. But they've also moved to smaller towns like Annapolis, Maryland, and parts of Suffolk County, Long Island. Most come for the reasons stated above, and many have become US citizens or are US residents. A good portion work menial jobs with little security or benefits, the type of jobs US citizens shun. Some set up restaurants or construction businesses and support their children through college. Salvadoran immigrants benefit from government services, the schools, the healthcare system, the police, and social welfare agencies. But they also pay taxes and still send what they can back home. Nearly 17% of El Salvador's GDP comes from remittances. Many Salvadorans I've spoken to think of their country constantly, often longing to return in spite of its troubles. To them, it's not a shithole, as Trump once famously described El Salvador and numerous other developing nations. It's a postcard. This strong sense of national identity helps sustain families through adversity. There is no easy way to fix the relationship between a mother and a son who have been separated for a decade. No magic renovation when 5 families are piled into a 2-bedroom apartment. There's no extra money for tutors or babysitters while guardians go to their second or third job of the day. Those that are left behind in El Salvador are sometimes saddled with worse problems: endemic corruption and grinding poverty, impunity and rampant violence, broken schools and filthy hospitals. But while it's clear that a major part of their problem is the neo-colonial system that the US helped to establish and maintain, many still dream of America, long for it, want to experience it themselves. The US is at once repressor and liberator. It is from this tumultuous love-hate relationship that the MS-13 was born. The gang is the bastard child that no one wants to acknowledge from an affair that most choose to ignore. Lost in this unhealthy relationship are the children, many of whom are victims of circumstance, caught in a system that marginalizes, vilifies, and tries to destroy them. Thanks. Donna, I'll turn it to you.
Okay. So I think that what you just read kind of leads into sort of my first question for you, which is that you had just spent the last 3 years doing an investigation into the gang, right? And you published a report, 89-page report in 2018. There's lots of other books about MS-13, and you cite some of the best ones, and yet you were still motivated to write this book now. Tell us a little bit more why. I think you were starting to tell us that by what you were describing there at the end, but what's the motivation for this book? Is it only just to know what this gang is, or is it bigger than that?
Well, I think that there are a couple things there. One is the process, and perhaps you went through it as well, and you can talk about it as well, of just getting to know the people who are involved in the gang. So, certainly when you do that, what you find are human beings, of course. What you're told about this gang, and I wasn't a member of a gang or anything like that growing up, so this is a very foreign world to me. But of course, what you're told is that these people are animals, they're irrational, they have no hearts and and of course, what you find are just human beings. And so that's sort of the thing that initially drives me, the feeling that I began to understand and find people who I think could help me tell a larger story about the human beings inside of this, this thing that they themselves also have trouble understanding. I mean, they look at it as a community, of course, as I mentioned, but they also call it, la bestia, right? The euphemism for the devil. So they understand the contradictions as good as well as anybody. So, I wanted to tell the story from their vantage point. So that was the first thing. But of course, the second thing is, and this comes, in part because I did Latin American studies at University of Texas, and because, my family has a long history of being involved in, this back and forth in politics between, especially in this hemisphere, between the United States and Latin America. I wanted to kind of look in the mirror, and hopefully have us look in the mirror and understand that the actions that we take and the policies that we have, they have real repercussions. And that I'm not going to talk about causality because we're on an academic forum and I'll get killed for it. But, there are implications for having certain policies. And those policies lead to, have consequences. And you can pretty much track the movement of the gang and the evolution of the gang as much via the gang itself, which is mostly the emphasis of these books, these kind of, slash 'em up machete style bloody books. That's what people want to read when they read the MS-13. They don't want to read how, public policy plays a very active role in really marginalizing entire populations, and that these kids are in essence falling through what is a very porous safety net into the hands of the gang. And not a lot of them, these are small percentages of the population, but enough of them. And then enough of those are also very violent and certainly, make a very big splash on a lot of newspapers and magazines and everything else, and really, drive our imagination around the gang. But there's whole other stories about the gang that we just don't know. We don't understand the people in the gang, their families, and all the policies that have helped drive the evolution of this gang. 40 years it's been around. And, it seems like the way that politicians often talk about it seems like they just found out about it. And they often did, I suppose.
So I want to ask you a little bit, too, about the structure with the book. We meet Norman in the courtroom in the very beginning, and he sort of comes across as laconic and initially, in dire circumstances, of course, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. But initially a rather understated choice, specifically for the reasons you're citing. People expect, kind of, oh, it's MS-13, and you're going to get drama from, the first moment. But then, it's clear, even by the end of the introduction, that we're going to see some twists and turns in his life. But you also sort of, in structuring it in three separate sections, this sort of getting in, getting serious, and then getting out. It's, as you described, it's the metaphor for sort of how an individual moves through the process, but also you're charting how the policy, intertwined. But then within each of the chapters, you also break it down into like subsections, right? It's very cinematic in approach, very episodic. Mm-hmm. So we're with Norman, and then we go into some history. We kind of go deep into policy. Then we come back. Then we maybe go to another character that's a thread that's going to pick up later, and then we go back. So it's not a very linear narrative. It's much more layered than that. What sort of made you decide that was the best way to tell this story?
Look, I wanted to tell I wanted to tell the whole story of the gang. I didn't necessarily think that one character encompassed the whole story of the gang. You can certainly argue that maybe with the case of Alex Sanchez. He's a very strong character, and I certainly think an entire book can be built around him. Movies, for that matter. I mean, it's just, talk about a cinematic life. There are those questions of being able to build an entire book around a single person is very hard. And for me, Norman was, I thought Norman, and starting Norman in the courtroom, and especially the immigration courtroom, was important for the following reason. I think that we think of these things, and there's a real push and pull in our system whereby we want to blame individuals, right? There's a whole discourse, an entire thought, ideology around this idea of resilience and all that other stuff, which I don't buy into for a second, but people believe that everybody's choices are their own. And so, especially in our judicial system, context is, and especially for brown and black people, context is taken out, right? It's ripped out. You're only supposed to think about exactly what they did. What were their actions? What did they do? What happened in the moment, right? And so you have Norman, who has to face the consequences for his actions. He was a gang member. He did murder. He's got to fess up to a number of things when he gets into the United States and he's talking to U.S. immigration authorities. But he's pleading for mercy. And what is the thing that he's using to plead for mercy? He's asking the judge through what's called the Convention Against Torture to evaluate the El Salvador government and determine whether or not there's a greater than 50% chance that if the judge sends him back to El Salvador, then he will be killed or tortured, right? That's the Convention Against Torture. So he's looking for relief under this particular international statute. And that is a collective guilt, right? So that is the push and pull. At what point are we just blaming these individuals for the decisions that they make? And at what point are we taking a step back and thinking about the collective responsibility that we have for putting them, obviously some of them make really bad, we all make bad decisions, but for putting them in these positions and for systematically marginalizing, them, for, eliminating, avenues of chance and possibility and advancement and jobs and everything else you want to talk about when you talk about marginalization. And certainly, I cite plenty of scholars who go through this, probably Diego Vigil would be the most prominent of them in talking about multiple marginalization. He literally uses that as his figure for explaining why this occurs. So that's why I started it there. Of course, some of the editors wanted to start with a massacre, but that's where all these gang books start. That's not where this question lies. This question lies on to what extent we accept collective guilt and to what extent we assign personal guilt. Our tendency is to assign personal guilt to all these guys. Everything that they did is, it's on them. And it's not just on them. It's on them and it's on us. As it relates to the larger structure, I definitely, I was thinking about this in terms of the larger story, and I have to say it kind of just played out that by the end, I was talking more about exiting the gang, just because that was the natural arc of the chronological story for these members. By the time we are reaching part 3, they've already gone through this evolution of entering, becoming very serious. And then by part 3, they are kind of exiting or trying to exit. And I'm trying to illustrate the difficulties that they run into in exiting, which isn't just the difficulties that come from gangs, which is what Norman runs into. He tries to escape the gang, and that's why he's asking for the Convention Against Torture. But also the law enforcement authorities who never trust ex-gang members and never believe that they've really left. And it is a complicated process. There are very strict rules about leaving the MS-13. And certainly a huge number of these guys age out and they just sort of fade away without any official process. But some of them ask for official permission to leave. And they may leave via the church. And some of them try to escape like Norman, but most of them just become what they call calmado, which essentially just means you got old. And you're just no use for us anymore. I mean, literally they just sort of outgrow it. And that's a very typical thing. So the arc of the stories of the individuals lent itself then by the end to talk about these 3 processes and shape the book in that way. In terms of selecting a number of different characters, just one more thing, and then certainly let you jump in again. But part of it is just access and how much information you're able to accumulate. I had probably 25,000 words of notes on Norman. That's enough to build a book around, but not necessarily for him to be the sole character. So you have to make decisions too as a writer and as a researcher, and how much you can get access to. So part of the question is also just utilitarian. How much access did you get?
I thought it was an interesting choice because we go from that intro right into the first section, and it's Alex Sanchez we meet first, right? And it's very the description. He's a very interesting and intriguing character right away as well. And so I just wondered about how you made that decision. But I actually liked how at the end, when we come back to Norman, he finally does have safety. He gets to stay, but it's not really. It's still, there's still a lot of things unsettled about it, right? And yeah. I assume you can't really tell us anything about, maybe you're still in touch with him or not, but, do you know if he's safe, that he finally, because the last scene, you see him, he's,
Yeah, as far as I know, he's safe. Look, he wins his case, so to say. He wins. He gets relief. The relief, it can always be temporary, by the way. The Attorney General at any time could just decide he needs to leave. They have that much control over that system. So, the judge decides that he will get relief. He has to check in every year. So he is checking in with ICE authorities at least once a year. If he moves, he has to tell ICE authorities that he's moved. So they know exactly who he is, where he is, They can make the decision to tell him to leave at any time, right? And he's being since he left the gang without permission, he's being chased. And yeah, as you point out, there's a scene at the end of the book where it's very dicey, and it was very dicey. And last I talked to him, I don't have any more information that he's not still alive. But I'm not telling you where he is for obvious reasons. I can't hear you. Go ahead.
That just brings a very quick, short question I have, which is, when you were thinking about writing the book, did you think about those kinds of, clearly you thought about, you didn't give us Norman's last name. We don't even know if that's his real name, right? Some gang researchers like Tom Ward in his book, he actually did composite characters and he gave people fake names, but clearly you're thinking also about the impact that publication of a book might have on someone's life too, and whether, revealing too much information about them puts them at risk.
It's a major concern, as you know. You know it better than me. You're taking actual photographs of them, so you don't even have that option. And especially these days with facial recognition stuff. So it is. I'm thankful. I wouldn't have been able to do the book otherwise, right? I make certain commitments to people when I'm with them in order to be able to tell their stories, and that is kind of. That I found that to be, the only way to be able to do these books. I would love to be able to reveal everyone's name, and certainly there's a lot of, if someone was, a very good sleuth, they could probably piece together a lot of things and certainly figure out a lot of things. But, I also know that, United States authorities know exactly who he is, and that's not his real name. And I know that Salvador authorities know exactly who he is, and they know where he is too. And I also know the gang, at least up until that stage, also knew where he was. It's a very complicated thing. But I'm honoring my commitment, and I will continue to honor that.
There's so many other themes. I could talk to you all day about this, because you covered the truce, you covered the Mexican mafia. And, I found that the kind of parallels that you drew kind of, over the course of the book between how the mafia kind of entrenched its power through the prison system, and then later developments in the Salvadoran prison system that kind of echo that or mirror it. It's different, but there are some parallels. I found that really fascinating. And the truce, of course, which is really important, because that was a moment when there was some hope that maybe, but then it was also complicated because it was giving a kind of political platform and power to the gang, and the civil society wasn't on board with that. That might not be the only issue, but I kind of want to, since we might not have that much more time to talk, I want to turn, because I was really affected by the story of Christian Mercado and also Alma, the unaccompanied minors who came and have really complicated lives and situations. Alma's more complicated in some ways, but both are complicated, right? Both got deported and now, are facing really difficult situations being back in Central America. And Alma, I don't know if you want to talk about that and, sort of how that brings us up to date with kind of current policy as well. When we're thinking about how we receive people that we do afford asylum, but then what kind of other resources they need to actually transition to living here.
Yeah, there's a couple of characters that come in along the way, and as you pointed out, one is Alma, and again, that's a name that I made up. That's not her real name for very similar reasons that I took with Norman. And Alma is a person who, was abused. She's raped by her step-grandfather when she's 8 years old. And again, she's beaten ceaselessly in her home. And she's the youngest of 12 kids in a rural area in El Salvador. And, kind of the extra labor in the house. I mean, she's a little bit kind of a representation of a transition period, right? Where, before you might have needed 12 kids to work on the field. You don't need them anymore, right? What happens to them? And she's caught in this kind of transition period, and she is just, mercilessly abused. And so she seeks out the gang, and she is an admitted bully. A person who says, I'm a bully. I enjoyed it even. And in order to sort of also beat back the abuse in her house, the gang affiliation works very well for her. The abuse in her house also stops as it relates to her, her abuse from her step-grandfather. She always, from then on, she always carries around a knife and a machete. Right. So that her story it just kind of tears you to shreds because, you know what she's gone through. She comes to the U.S. After going, basically going sideways with the gang. And again, trying to escape the gang like so many are when they're coming to the U.S. And she gets to the border, and amazingly, no one even asks her if she was in the gang. Right. They just assume she wasn't in the gang. And then she lands in the Maryland, D.C., Virginia area. And I think the important thing about her relationship with the gang in the United States is that it's not like people think. Like, it's not like, oh, you're in or you're out, and you have to, it's a full-time job. It's so not a full-time job, and you're so not in or out. You're kind of in when you want to and out when you don't want to. And it's not this sort of, straitjacket relationship that people think about. It's very fluid. It's a very dynamic relationship. And that's the relationship that she has with the gang over all these years, even though she's, run, sideways with the gang and then tries to sort of inch her way back in. So that's Alma. I mean, she's just this complex character. And then Christian is the embodiment of the fusion of all these different law enforcement and immigration enforcement. He's the point at which these efforts, come all the way, sort of full throttle, hit their apex, and have entered into the school system. to the point where the people inside the school system are basically working with the immigration enforcement authorities, and passing erroneous raw intelligence out to these enforcement authorities and wrongfully accusing him of being in the gang. So you may think going into the chapter that he is a member of the gang, when in fact he's not. And literally comes in contact with the gang because he's lost in the system, because he's literally falling through these cracks. He can't speak the language. So one of the teachers assigns another student to help him out and find his classrooms. And that other student is a member of the gang. So the system literally connects him with the gang. The poorly thought through system connects him with the gang. Then he gets blamed for it. In this sort of very, obviously very contentious environment that's going on in Long Island, where his story is based. So this two characters, really bring us up to speed in terms of where we are now.
We have a few questions coming, so we want to make sure that you address them. We have one from Fatima Valdivia, Austin. How does your own gender and citizenship and American identity plays into this research? Someone with a different background will be telling a different story about the gang?
I didn't catch the first part of that, Paloma. How does the U.S. citizen?
Your own gender, your own...
Oh, my own gender and citizenship. Yeah. I think for sure it plays into how I see this. For sure it plays into, my access or not access to certain, characters and communities and, my understanding of their own stories. I do my best to tell the stories through their words, and through their lives. But of course, I'm making decisions for them, what parts to highlight, what to not highlight. In the case of Alma, for example, and I state this at the beginning of the book, I really think that there's so much more work that could be done on both masculinity as a driving factor for the creation of the gang, and especially in spaces like jails. And I talk about this a little bit in the book itself, which is the prevalence of sexual assault and rape, and how that it really is a driving force for them to coalesce in the gangs, inside the prisons. The fear of physical assault and rape is hugely important, and really our studies should be studies on their own, as should be the elements of female participation and interaction with gang members. So, I fall short on that, but I did my best to sort of include, Alma in this discussion. And my wife is Colombian and basically tries to check me at every point as it relates to my privilege as a United States citizen, my privilege as a white male, and certainly reading a lot of that stuff out loud to her and her slapping me on my wrist. Hopefully I've done my best to sort of, at least as best I can, to sort of check my privilege. But I appreciate the question.
Someone is asking, are your glasses for sale? I'm going to assume that's a compliment for all of us. I'm not going to. Okay, we have a question from an immigration attorney who has worked with children. She said, I'm curious about your definition of gang membership as fluid. Was that how you describe it while you interview youth as being fluid? Can you address that?
Did she say she was furious? Is that what I heard?
You can also read it in the chat here. She's talking about fluid membership in the gang.
Oh, fluid membership in the gang. Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm just kind of poking around here in the public. I'm curious. Got it. Okay. I'm curious about the definition of gang members. Yes, I think that there is, I would say that there is a pretty marketable difference between the United States and Central America in this regard. I think it's much more fluid and dynamic in the United States and a little bit stricter, I would say, as it relates to Central American countries. The countries where I have the most experience as it relates to gangs are Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And in those spaces, it is a little bit more rigid. It is you're in the gang or you're not in the gang. It's much closer to that. And it is a little bit closer to, or can really be kind of more of a full-time job in those spaces. In the United States, it is much less so. In the United States, you get a lot of part-timers, and many of them are taking out of their own earnings from painting houses or fixing gardens or whatever they're doing to make a living. And then that's where their weekly or monthly quotas that they're giving to the gang are coming from their earnings, from their legitimate job, So there's this sort of belief that, all of these things are coming together in a way that are all criminal. And that's just simply not true. And so, it's very complex and I would say much more fluid than in the United States, than in Central America, just to sum it up.
Ken Green, professor in the Department of Government, is asking if California politics in general, like Proposition 187 or others, play a role in the gang in the 90s.
Yeah, I'm looking at Ken's. Hello, Ken. Nice to see you again. I'm looking at it here in the chat. What I will say about that, and I don't know about the Prop 187 and three strikes exactly, but they were kind of more on the tail end. Most of the period that I cover is the late 80s. And they come on the tail end of that process. So really that begins 86, 87. We start seeing gang injunctions, gang enhancements. These special units, the crash units, begin in the late 70s, really. And so that kind of mass incarceration really begins in the late 80s. It hits its apex, 91, 92. And I go through some of that, and some of the numbers are just stunning. That thousands and thousands of Latino youth that are thrown into jail in LA County. Your jaw will drop when you look at these numbers just from LA County. I mean, it's amazing how many people were flowing in and out of these systems, and it played a major part in the evolution of the gang, because that is when they fall under the purview of what Donna was talking about earlier, the Mexican mafia, and they become part of these larger networks. And then later, of course, we get a further evolution of that, which is the expanding of the number of categories for which ex-convicts can be deported, which happens in 1996 under the Clinton administration. And so that accelerates the deportation. So not only are we getting more gang members or suspected gang members being tossed into jail for all kinds of reasons during this whole period, but then you get more ex-convicts being jettisoned off into Central America. And then to compound all that, and this also starts in the late 1980s, and I go through this in the book, that's the beginning of the fusion of immigration enforcement and law enforcement. They start ICE, or precursor to ICE, starts working with literally with the Rampart and the crash unit in Rampart to start deporting gang members. So that all of that begins really kind of before that. So the three strikes is almost a culmination of that period rather than a beginning.
Steve, I have a question about discrimination in the gang in terms of access and moving up in power in terms of gender and race. Did you notice any difference? How high can women get in positions of power in the gang?
Yeah, and Don, I'm sure, can talk about this as well, but they're not in anymore. They're at a certain point in the early 2000s, I don't know what year, I can't put a flag on it or anything like that, but they decided no more women. There is, and Thomas Ward also goes through this in his book, He's got a long section, of maybe even a chapter about this, where he talks about there's just sort of this distrust, and it's misogynist. There's a distrust of women. They think that they're going to fold easier, they'll become snitches easier. There are so many male snitches, but they just kind of disregard all of that information, as you can imagine, and it's very misogynist. And so the role of women, has pretty much dissipated to be these messengers, and in some instances maybe bookkeepers. But again, because the relationship between the family and the gang is very intimate, are they the bookkeeper for the gang or the bookkeeper of the family? Maybe a mix of both. So those are the kinds of roles that I have seen women play. I don't know if Donna wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, when I started working in the early 90s, there was actually a clique of just homegirls, right, from MS. And a lot of different cliques had a few. And some of them were really smart and had a lot of leadership skills, but they got pushed aside, right? There was this feeling that somehow that was threatening as well. And I think that you notice also that even in the gang violence prevention, of former gang members who are working, to try and help people not join gangs or to discourage gang, you don't find women there either, even though there are plenty of former homegirls who would be effective actually in those roles, but you don't find them. So that is somebody else wants to ask, but that's why I was so curious when Alma was drifting back towards the gang after getting sent home, because it just seemed to me that maybe El Tigre treats her with special care and she really trusts him, but without him, she's LGBTQ, she's a woman. How would she be protected by them? And it just seemed counterintuitive. Given they won't even allow girls, she wouldn't be allowed to be a full member with rights now.
Yeah, I didn't mention that, but she, I don't know whether she called herself a lesbian, but she's lesbian. Yeah, she's LGBTQ, and it certainly influences her relationship with the gang, because the gang is, it has rules against being gay. Now, I'm not sure how much that applies to females, and I don't know how much you know about that. Go ahead, Donna. I can't hear.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I knew one female gang member that I interviewed at large that I knew over a period of time in LA in the early years, who had a very similar story to Alma, and she was she was a homegirl, and she was a real leader. And she was openly gay, and the gang accepted it, right? Because they saw her as really being tougher than the guys, right? So it's kind of, it's hard to just generalize, and things go through changes over time as well in context. But I would say in El Salvador, that would be much less likely. That was in LA, not in El Salvador.
Very hard. You can imagine. I mean, LGBTQ in El Salvador, targeted by gangs, targeted by police, obviously ostracized, in her own very Catholic family.
Yeah.
And I go through some of this in the book. And as you mentioned, her complex relationship with her progenitor in the gang, who's this guy, El Tigre, who's still operational in the area. And look, she's in an area where there are vigilante groups that control the area and that have executed suspected gang members. So my suspicion is really her dad is their only buffer between those vigilante groups that are killing suspected gang members and her. So, and in the interim, she lives 100 yards from her step-grandfather who raped her when she was 8. He lives on the house up the hill. So it's, literally it's purgatory. Paloma, we can't hear you.
Paloma, we can't hear you.
We have time to take 2 more questions. So there's one from Macaulay Bruton here, and it says, what factors may explain that this gang is more violent than gangs from other regions or nationalities? He mentioned Vietnamese, Haitian, Cuban, etc.
It's not. We have no evidence to say that it's any more or any less violent. There's nothing to indicate that it's any more violent. We know that it's much smaller than its rivals, for instance, and it certainly doesn't get the attention of other organizations that are, the 18th Street, which is its main rival, is by the United States government's own count 5 times larger than the MS-13 in the United States. Yet, do you ever hear any politician talk about the 18th Street? Never. In terms of violence, there was a peak of sorts, and the best work is being done, and they haven't finished yet, as far as I know. At least they haven't published yet. It was being done at Virginia Commonwealth with Michael Parberg, and they had a whole bunch of students that were literally going through the last 20 years of suspected MS via judicial records and then also media reports, and it peaked out at I believe it was 46 murders in 1 year. Look, that's a lot. I'm not going to try and downplay that, but we need to. That was the worst year in the last 20 years, so we need to put these things into their proper perspective. As it relates to this, what happens with the MS-13 is 2 things. One is that they do have these very public and bloody murders that are often reaching the level, on an international standard anyway, of massacres, 4 and above. Those are horrific. And the other thing about those is that they happen with blunt instruments and often in collectives. So groups of them are doing it, and that is those 2 things are what distinguish the murders and what make us believe that they are more violent, and that is effective for them as well, vis-a-vis their enemies, vis-a-vis their rivals. I mean, this is part of what they're doing with those particular actions.
Okay, we have the last question, and it makes sense. It's a U.S. politics question. Before going there, let me remind you that next week's in Texas early voting starts. Make sure that you're registered and you vote on time. Sarah Moore wants to know, how does current U.S. international and domestic policy create or perpetuate these issues, and what policies are necessary to generate change?
This is the big question that we certainly need to ask ourselves, and what I was trying to ask myself throughout. It's multifold. We've created systems that marginalize entire populations, and not only have we done this for the last 40 years, but we've also debilitated and defunded these institutions over this last period of time, while simultaneously beefing up the repressive side of the response to these gangs. So while we're beefing up the whole, police and military and deportation and immigration security system and all of that, we are also taking away resources from all of the other parts of the ways in which we can integrate people and give them opportunities. We're talking about educational opportunities, good health care, social services, so early intervention in families that are, that have abuse problems, physical and sexual abuse. All of those things have been systematically defunded over these last few years, while we're at the same time beefing up the repressive side. So I think we need to rebalance that equation. I'm not saying that law enforcement isn't needed. Of course it is. But we need to figure out how to balance out that equation much better. And that's the only way to, at least mitigate. I don't think we're going to eradicate. This isn't about eradication. You don't win this war, but I think you can mitigate. You can mitigate the impact of these gangs like the MS-13.
Thank you so much, Steve. This is really enlightening. We are proud of you being our alumnus going around talking about us. Thank you for doing that. Thank you, Donna. It was a pleasure to see you again. Before closing, I want to remind everyone